No one noticed when I started carrying everything alone. There was no announcement, no visible change, no moment where someone looked at me and said, "You seem different." From the outside, my life looked fine. I showed up, I worked, I answered messages, I smiled when needed. Nothing was falling apart. That was the problem. When things break loudly, people rush in. They ask questions. They offer help. But when things slowly wear you down from the inside, silently, no one sees it. And you learn to keep going anyway. That was the phase I entered without realizing it. I didn't wake up one day feeling strong. I woke up feeling tired and chose to move forward anyway. Not because I was brave, not because I had a plan, because stopping did not feel like an option. Each day asked the same thing of me: get up, do what needs to be done, don't explain too much. So I did. I learned how to hold conversations while my mind was somewhere else. I learned how to listen without letting my own thoughts spill out. I learned how to nod, to agree, to say, "Yeah, I'm okay," in a tone that ended the conversation quickly. People often mistake this for confidence. They think silence means strength. They think calm means certainty. They don't see the effort behind it. They don't see how much energy it takes to remain steady when everything inside feels unstable. At work, I became reliable, not exceptional, not passionate, just reliable. The kind of person who gets things done without complaining. The kind of person people trust because I never made things complicated. I did not ask for help. Not because I didn't need it, but because I didn't know how to ask without opening something I wasn't ready to face. So I carried it myself. Every doubt, every question, every quiet fear about the future. I carried them into meetings, into long commutes, into empty evenings. They sat beside me, patient, unseen. There were moments when I felt close to breaking, not in dramatic ways, just small cracks. Standing alone in an elevator, staring at my reflection, feeling unfamiliar to myself. Walking home after a long day, suddenly aware of how heavy my steps felt. Sitting in a room full of people and feeling completely separate from them. In those moments, I didn't collapse. I adjusted. I took a deeper breath. I straightened my posture. I reminded myself, just get through today. That sentence became my anchor. Not tomorrow, not next year, just today. There is a certain kind of strength that grows when you live like this. It is not loud. It does not look impressive. It does not post quotes or announce lessons learned. It is quiet endurance, the ability to keep showing up without applause, without recognition, without certainty that it will pay off. I did not feel proud of this strength. Most of the time, I didn't even recognize it as strength. It felt like necessity, like something I did because there was no alternative. People around me talked about big decisions, quitting jobs, starting over, finding their passion. I listened. I nodded. Inside, I felt disconnected from those conversations. Not because I didn't want change, but because I was still learning how to stand where I was. Change felt like a luxury I couldn't afford yet. First, I needed stability. Not external stability, internal. The kind that allows you to wake up and face the day without falling apart. That was my quiet goal. Some evenings, after everyone else had gone to sleep, I sat alone and allowed myself to feel the weight. I didn't journal. I didn't analyze. I just sat there, letting the tiredness exist. There is a difference between giving up and resting. I was resting in place, even if it didn't look like rest. I started noticing something subtle. Even though I felt uncertain, even though I felt tired, I was still choosing to act with care. I still did my work well. I still treated people gently. I still showed up when it mattered. Not because I felt motivated, but because I valued who I wanted to be, even in difficult seasons. That realization surprised me. It showed me a part of myself I had not acknowledged before. Strength does not always come from confidence. Sometimes it comes from values, from deciding quietly, I will not become careless just because life feels heavy. That decision shaped my days. It shaped how I spoke, how I listened, how I moved through the world. Even when I felt lost, I was still choosing my behavior. And that mattered more than I realized at the time. There were days when I felt invisible, days when my effort went unnoticed, days when my silence was misunderstood. But there were also moments, small ones, that reminded me why I kept going. A colleague trusting me with something important, a friend opening up because they felt safe around me, a stranger thanking me for something small. These moments did not fix my confusion, but they grounded me. They reminded me that presence has value, even when direction is unclear. I began to understand that not every phase of life is about becoming more. Some phases are about holding steady, about not collapsing under the weight of unanswered questions, about maintaining your integrity when no one is watching. This kind of strength is built quietly. It does not ask for recognition. It simply grows, layer by layer, day by day. I did not talk about this phase much. Words felt inadequate. How do you explain a struggle that doesn't have a clear shape? How do you describe a battle that happens entirely inside? So I kept it to myself, not out of secrecy, but out of respect for the process. Some things need silence to mature. I noticed that over time, my relationship with uncertainty changed. It no longer felt like an enemy. It felt like a companion walking beside me, not comforting, but honest. It reminded me to stay alert, to stay humble, to stay present. I stopped demanding answers from myself. I stopped asking, why am I like this? Instead, I asked, how can I move through this without losing myself? That question shaped everything. It shaped my pace, my expectations, my inner dialogue. I learned to measure progress differently, not by results, but by resilience, not by clarity, but by consistency, not by confidence, but by character. This phase did not make me louder. It made me steadier. It did not give me a story people would applaud. It gave me something more private. The knowledge that even in confusion, even in fatigue, I could be trusted to carry myself with care. That knowledge changed how I saw myself. And maybe, so that is what real inner strength looks like. Not the absence of struggle, but the ability to remain intact while carrying it. Not being fearless, but continuing anyway. Not knowing where you are going, but choosing how you walk each step of the way. Life didn't collapse. That was the part no one ever noticed. There was no single moment where everything broke, no dramatic scene, no loud failure that forced people to pay attention. Things simply continued. Morning still arrived, whether you were ready or not. The phone still buzzed with messages. Work still needed to be done. Bills still waited. People still expected answers. And you still showed up. From the outside, nothing looked wrong. You were present. You were responsive. You were doing what needed to be done. If someone looked at your life from a distance, They would probably describe it as stable, maybe even successful. But stability can be deceptive, because sometimes it's just a well-organized way of surviving. Inside, something was being carried quietly, not loudly enough to be seen, not heavy enough to stop you from moving, but heavy enough to change how everything felt. You didn't talk about it, not because you didn't want to, but because you didn't know how to explain something that had no clear shape. How do you tell someone that you're tired when nothing specific is wrong? How do you explain that you're exhausted, not from work, not from people, but from holding yourself together every single day? So you stayed silent. At first, silence felt practical. There was no obvious benefit in speaking. No one was asking the right questions anyway. People asked, "How are you?" And they expected a short answer. People asked, "How's work?" And they expected progress. People asked, "What's next?" And they expected ambition. So you gave them what they were ready to hear. "I'm fine. Busy, but good. Just focusing on work." And slowly, silence stopped being a choice. It became a habit. You learned how to move through conversations without revealing anything real. You learned how to laugh at the right moments. You learned how to keep your voice steady, even when something inside you felt fragile. Over time, that performance became automatic. You didn't feel fake. You just felt distant, like you were living slightly behind a glass wall, watching yourself function. What made it harder was that nothing was technically wrong. You weren't in crisis. You weren't falling apart. You weren't failing. You were enduring. And endurance rarely gets attention. People celebrate breakthroughs. They notice collapses. They react to visible change. But endurance happens quietly. It happens in the background. It happens in the spaces no one looks at. It happens when you wake up tired and still get out of bed. When you feel disconnected and still show up. When you question everything and still keep going. That kind of strength doesn't look impressive. It looks ordinary. And because it looks ordinary, it goes unnoticed. There were moments when you wondered if you were imagining the weight. You told yourself, other people have it worse. You reminded yourself of what you should be grateful for. You minimized your own experience until it barely existed. But the weight didn't disappear. It just became quieter. It showed up in small ways. In the way you felt drained after simple interactions. In the way weekends didn't feel restorative anymore. In the way you needed more silence than before, but didn't know what to do with it. You started to feel tired without being able to explain why. Not sleepy, not physically exhausted, just tired. A deep, steady tiredness that didn't go away with rest. And still, you kept going, because stopping felt dangerous. If you stopped, you might have to look at what you were carrying. And you weren't sure you were ready for that. So you kept moving. You filled your schedule. You stayed productive. You stayed useful. Being useful became a form of safety. As long as you were needed, as long as you were contributing, as long as you were functioning, you didn't have to ask difficult questions. You didn't have to ask whether this life still fit you, whether the direction you were moving in was chosen or simply continued. There was comfort in routine, even when it felt empty. Routine meant predictability. Predictability meant control. And control felt better than uncertainty. But under that control, something subtle was happening. You were becoming quieter inside, not calmer, just quieter. Your reactions dulled. Your excitement softened. Your curiosity shrank, not because you stopped caring, but because caring required energy you no longer had to spare. You conserved yourself. You stopped reaching out unless necessary. You stopped explaining unless asked. You stopped sharing thoughts that might complicate things. Life became simpler on the surface and heavier underneath. Sometimes, late at night, you noticed the weight more clearly, when distractions faded, when the world slowed down, when there was no one to perform for. That was when questions appeared. Not loud questions, just quiet ones. How long can I keep doing this? Is this who I'm becoming? When did I stop feeling connected to my own life? You didn't panic. You didn't cry. You just lay there, staring at the ceiling, feeling something unnamed. Those moments didn't change anything immediately. They didn't lead to dramatic decisions. They simply accumulated, like drops of water, slow, persistent. And over time, they began to shape something inside you. Not a breakdown, not a breakthrough, just awareness. A subtle realization that endurance, no matter how strong, was not meant to be permanent. That surviving silently was not the same as living. And even if no one saw the struggle, even if no one acknowledged the weight, it was real. You were carrying it, day after day, quietly, consistently, and that quiet strength, unnoticed as it was, had been holding your life together longer than anyone would ever know. Something shifted after that awareness appeared. Not in a dramatic way, not overnight. Nothing about your life suddenly changed. But once you noticed the weight, you could no longer pretend it wasn't there. You still woke up. You still went to work. You still followed routines. Yet underneath all of it, there was a quiet tension, like holding your breath without realizing it. You started to see how long you had been enduring without asking yourself why. Endurance had become your default response. When things felt uncomfortable, you endured. When you felt uncertain, you endured. When life stopped feeling meaningful, you endured. It wasn't bravery. It wasn't discipline. It was conditioning. Somewhere along the way, you learned that slowing down was risky, that questioning too much could destabilize everything, that pausing might expose things you didn't have answers for. So you learned to keep going. But awareness has a way of changing the rules. Once you see a pattern, you can't unsee it. You began to notice how often you dismissed your own feelings, how quickly you rationalized discomfort, how efficiently you talked yourself out of listening inward. You told yourself stories. This is just a phase. Everyone feels like this. I should be grateful. Those stories weren't lies. They were survival tools. They helped you move forward when stopping felt unsafe. They helped you stay functional when things felt hollow. They helped you avoid confronting questions that felt too large. But slowly, those stories stopped working. Not because they were wrong, but because they were incomplete. Gratitude didn't erase exhaustion. Perspective didn't restore connection. Logic didn't fill emotional gaps. You could understand your situation perfectly and still feel disconnected from it. That realization was unsettling, because if endurance wasn't the answer anymore, what was? You didn't know, and not knowing felt dangerous. For a long time, you had relied on certainty to keep yourself steady. Clear goals, clear expectations, clear next steps. Uncertainty threatened that structure. It invited questions you weren't prepared to answer. What do you do when the life you built no longer feels like home, but you don't know where else to go? What do you do when the version of yourself that survived is no longer the version that wants to live? Those questions didn't demand immediate action. They simply existed, quiet, persistent, and because they didn't shout, they were easy to ignore at first. You kept yourself busy. You filled time with tasks. You stayed productive. Productivity was familiar. It gave you measurable results. It reassured you that you were still moving forward. But movement without direction started to feel empty. You noticed it in small moments, in the way you finished something and felt nothing afterward, in the way achievements no longer brought relief, in the way success felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. You weren't unhappy. You just weren't present. Life was happening. Say, but you were slightly removed from it. That distance was subtle, but it mattered. It affected how you listened to people, how you reacted to good news, how you handled disappointment. You became careful with yourself, conservative, contained. Not because you were weak, but because you had been holding too much for too long. There were moments when you considered opening up, not dramatically, just honestly, but each time you stopped yourself. What would you even say? I'm tired sounded insufficient. I feel lost felt exaggerated. I don't know what I'm doing felt irresponsible. So you stayed quiet. Silence felt safer than vulnerability. Silence didn't require explanations. Silence didn't create expectations. But silence also isolated you. It made you feel like you were the only one experiencing this kind of internal disconnect. You looked around and saw people moving forward, making decisions, building lives, and you wondered why it seemed so easy for them. You didn't envy their success. You envied their certainty. You wanted to feel aligned again, to feel like your actions matched something inside you. But alignment requires honesty, and honesty requires courage. Courage not just to change, but to admit that something isn't working. That admission felt heavy. It threatened the image you had built, the story others believed about you, the narrative you told yourself. For years, you had been the one who managed, who adapted, who endured. Letting go of that identity felt like letting go of safety. So instead of changing, you observed. You watched your reactions. You listened to your thoughts. You noticed when something drained you and when something quietly energized you. You didn't act on those observations yet. You just collected them. Awareness without action can feel frustrating, but it can also be protective. It gives you time to understand what you're actually feeling instead of reacting impulsively. Slowly, you began to see patterns. You noticed how certain environments made you tense, how certain conversations left you exhausted, how certain expectations felt suffocating, and you noticed the opposite too. Moments of calm, moments of focus, moments when time passed differently. Those moments were rare, but they mattered. They reminded you that numbness wasn't permanent, that something inside you still responded. That realization brought a quiet relief. Not hope, exactly. Just confirmation. Confirmation that you weren't broken, that the exhaustion wasn't random, that the struggle had context. You weren't failing at life. You were outgrowing a version of it. That understanding didn't solve anything immediately, but it softened the weight. It gave you permission to be curious instead of judgmental, to ask questions without demanding answers. You didn't need to fix everything. You just needed to listen differently to yourself, to your reactions, to the quiet signals you had been ignoring. Endurance had carried you this far. It had protected you. It had kept you moving. But endurance alone could not tell you where to go next. And for the first time, you allowed yourself to consider that moving forward might not require more strength, but more honesty. Not with the world, not with others, but with yourself. That honesty did not arrive as a bold declaration. It came quietly. It showed up in moments where you stopped pushing yourself to feel something you didn't. In moments where you allowed discomfort to exist without immediately trying to fix it. For the first time in a long while, you let yourself stay with what you were feeling. Not to analyze it, not to judge it, just to notice it. And what you noticed surprised you. The exhaustion was not just physical. It wasn't even emotional in the way you once thought. It was directional. You were tired of walking without knowing where you were going. Tired of saying yes to paths that felt neutral at best. Tired of maintaining momentum without meaning. That realization changed how you saw your past endurance. Endurance had saved you before. It helped you survive uncertainty. It helped you stay afloat when stability mattered more than fulfillment. But now, endurance was being asked to do a job it wasn't designed for. It was being asked to provide purpose. And it couldn't. You began to understand that there was a difference between surviving a phase and living a life. Survival compresses you. It narrows your focus. It teaches you to prioritize safety over expression. Living requires the opposite. It asks you to expand, to risk uncertainty, to allow parts of yourself to be seen again. That shift felt intimidating, because expansion meant vulnerability, and vulnerability meant losing control. For years, control had been your anchor. You controlled your reactions, your words, your image, your trajectory. Control kept things predictable. Predictability kept things manageable. Letting go of that felt like stepping onto unstable ground. So you didn't leap. You tested. You made small adjustments, barely noticeable ones. You stopped forcing enthusiasm in conversations that drained you. You allowed yourself to decline invitations without over-explaining. You gave yourself permission to rest without justifying it. These weren't dramatic changes. No one else noticed. But you did. And that was enough. You started to feel a subtle difference. Not happiness, not excitement. Space. Mental space. Emotional space. Space to think without rushing to conclusions. Space to feel without suppressing reactions. Space to question without demanding immediate answers. That space felt unfamiliar. And because it was unfamiliar, it felt slightly uncomfortable. You were used to being full. Full schedules, full expectations, full responsibilities. Emptiness felt risky. But this wasn't emptiness. It was margin. And within that margin, something important began to happen. Your thoughts slowed down. Instead of jumping from one obligation to the next, you began to notice patterns in how you responded to life. You noticed what energized you, even in small doses. You noticed what drained you, even when it looked reasonable on paper. You noticed how often you had ignored these signals before, not out of ignorance, but out of necessity. At one point, ignoring yourself had been the only way forward. Now it wasn't. That realization brought a mix of relief and grief. Relief, because you no longer had to push through everything. Grief, because you realized how long you had lived disconnected from yourself. You mourned quietly, not for lost opportunities, not for specific choices, but for the version of you that had adapted so well that it forgot how to ask what it wanted. That grief didn't overwhelm you. It settled gently, like acknowledging an old wound that had healed incorrectly, but healed nonetheless. You didn't blame yourself. You understood. You did what you needed to do with the tools you had at the time. That understanding softened your self-criticism. You stopped asking, "What's wrong with me?" and started asking, "What am I responding to?" That shift changed everything. Instead of viewing your exhaustion as failure, you saw it as information. Instead of seeing your numbness as weakness, you saw it as a signal. Instead of pushing yourself harder, you listened more closely. Listening didn't give you immediate clarity. It didn't hand you a new life plan, but it grounded you. It reminded you that you were still present, still capable of responding, still able to choose differently. That awareness created a new kind of responsibility. Not responsibility to perform, not responsibility to succeed, responsibility to be honest with yourself. That honesty required patience. You couldn't undo years of endurance overnight. You couldn't suddenly feel aligned after so long of adaptation. So you allowed the process to be slow. You let uncertainty exist. You let questions remain unanswered. You let discomfort pass through you instead of defining you. This patience felt unfamiliar too. You were used to solving problems, fixing things, optimizing outcomes. But this wasn't a problem to be solved. It was a transition to be lived. And transitions don't follow timelines. They follow readiness. Some days you felt hopeful, light, curious. Other days you felt stuck, restless, unsure. You learned not to overinterpret either. Hope didn't mean you had arrived. Restlessness didn't mean you were failing. They were both part of recalibration. You were recalibrating your relationship with yourself. That process changed how you interacted with the world. You became less reactive, less eager to prove, less willing to stretch yourself thin for things that didn't matter to you. Not out of bitterness, out of clarity. You weren't withdrawing. You were refining. Refining where you placed your energy. Refining what you said yes to. Refining how much of yourself you gave away by default. That refinement made your life quieter. And in that quiet, you began to recognize something important. You had been strong for a long time, strong enough to endure invisibly, strong enough to function without support, strong enough to keep going even when meaning felt distant. But strength alone was no longer the goal. Presence was. Alignment was. A sense of internal coherence that didn't rely on external validation. You didn't know exactly what that would look like yet, but you could feel the direction, not as a clear destination, as a subtle pull. And for the first time, instead of resisting that pull, you allowed yourself to follow it at your own pace, quietly, carefully, without announcing it to the world. Because this part of the journey was not meant to be witnessed. It was meant to be integrated. Following that pull did not lead to immediate clarity. It didn't suddenly rearrange your life. It didn't hand you a perfect plan. It didn't remove uncertainty. What it did was quieter and more important. It brought you back into yourself. You began to notice that you were no longer moving just because momentum demanded it. You were no longer saying yes just to maintain an image. You were no longer enduring out of habit. You were choosing. The choices were small at first, almost invisible to anyone else. Choosing to rest when your body asked for it. Choosing to pause instead of reacting. Choosing honesty over convenience, even when that honesty stayed private. These choices didn't make your life easier overnight, but they made it feel more yours, and that difference mattered. You started to feel present in moments again. Not constantly, not perfectly, but enough to notice. You noticed how your breath changed when something felt right. You noticed how tension appeared when something felt misaligned. You noticed how your energy responded before your logic had time to explain it away. For years, you had overridden those signals. You trusted discipline more than intuition, endurance more than awareness. Now you were relearning how to listen. That listening reshaped how you understood strength. Strength was no longer about how much you could carry. It was about how carefully you chose what to carry. You realized that endurance had been necessary, but it had also been expensive. It had cost you connection. It had cost you softness. It had cost you curiosity. And yet, you didn't resent it. You honored it. Because endurance had protected you when you didn't have the freedom to choose differently. It had kept you stable when chaos would have broken you. It had given you time. Now that time had done its work. You didn't need to endure in the same way anymore. That realization didn't make you loud. It didn't make you dramatic. It didn't make you announce a transformation. It made you quieter, not withdrawn, not distant, grounded. You stopped explaining yourself to people who weren't listening. You stopped justifying your pace. You stopped chasing validation for choices that felt internally aligned. Your confidence changed shape. It was no longer performative. It no longer needed witnesses. It was internal. A calm knowing that even if no one saw your struggle, even if no one understood your journey, you did. And that was enough. You began to move through life with less urgency and more intention. You didn't rush to define yourself. You didn't pressure yourself to arrive. You allowed growth to unfold without forcing it into a narrative. Some days still felt uncertain. Some days still felt heavy. But the weight was different now. It wasn't the weight of suppression. It was the weight of responsibility. The responsibility of living honestly. That responsibility didn't overwhelm you. It steadied you. Because you were no longer fighting yourself. You were cooperating with who you were becoming. You noticed how resilience changed when it was paired with self-respect. How discipline softened when it wasn't driven by fear. How ambition clarified when it wasn't fueled by avoidance. Your life didn't suddenly look extraordinary. It didn't need to. It felt aligned. And alignment, you learned, doesn't shout. It hums quietly in the background, supporting you instead of demanding from you. You no longer needed your strength to be recognized. You knew what it had carried you through. You knew what it had cost. You knew what it had made possible. That knowledge lived inside you as a quiet steadiness, a quiet power, the kind that doesn't compete, the kind that doesn't rush, the kind that doesn't need to prove anything. Just presence, just integrity, just forward movement that feels true. And if you are listening to this and recognizing pieces of yourself, if you have been enduring quietly, functioning well while feeling disconnected, carrying weight that no one sees, know this. You are not weak. You are not broken. You are not behind. You are strong in a way that often goes unnoticed. but strength that remains invisible for too long can turn into isolation. You deserve more than survival. You deserve a life that feels like participation, not just endurance. If this story resonated with you, if it helped you feel seen or understood, take a moment to support this channel. Like the video, subscribe to the channel. It helps me continue sharing stories like this. Stories for people who carry quietly, who grow slowly, and who are learning that their quiet strength is enough.